Okay, so I think it's a good time to start our sessions today. We're very honored to have our special lecturer from Victoria University of Wellington, New Zealand, Associate Professor Dr. Jonathan Newton, and today he will be have a special lecture on TBLT and research in EFL classroom from theory to practice. And may I please introduce him a little bit? Associate Professor Dr. Jonathan Newton. He is the program director in the Master of TESOLs and Applied Linguistics in the School of Linguistics and Applied Language Studies at Victoria University of Wellington. And he is also he he has more than 30 years of experiences in academic and teacher educators, and also he has a wide experience of engaging in teaching across Asia. He has been scholarship span task-based language teaching, or TBLT, that he'll be lecturing today, teaching, listening, and speaking, and also teaching vocabulary and teaching for intercultural competence. He has been published more than 70 articles and book chapters and has co-authored 3 books. The first book is Teaching ESL, EFL Listening and Speaking in 2009. And in 2010, he published a book entitled Workplace Talk in Action and ESOL Resource. And also in 2018, he published his 3rd book, Teaching English to Second Language Learner in Academic Context. Also, his further books will be published in 2020. The book entitled Culture in the Asian EFL Classroom Using Task in Language Teaching and Teaching Speaking. So today we're very honored to have him. And before we start the special lectures, I would like to invite Associate Professor Dr. Akrapol Nermaihong to please give a welcoming speech. Please, sir.
Sawadee Good morning. Ming Kalaba to my Burmese student and Ni Hao Ma to my Chinese student. I think we also have the Vietnamese participant, but I don't know, sorry to say, to greet in Vietnamese language, but I think Jonathan can speak Vietnamese. Okay, let's see. So I attend this session at the initial stage on behalf of the BRU president and also the dean of HUSOC faculty. Our BRU president informed that we are having the guest speaker from New Zealand today. She's supposed to come and deliver a thankful message. Unfortunately, she engaged with the other meeting, so she assigned me on her behalf to deliver a thankful message to Jonathan, Professor Jonathan. I think at our opening ceremony of ICON 3rd, our president also delivered an opening speech. I think Jonathan still remember her. I also the dean of the faculty since PhD program ELT under my faculty, and also I'm the chairman of this program as well. So a lot of hats. I'm holding a lot of hats as the chairman and the dean, so on behalf of the BRU president. All participants, please be informed that this webinar is a part of post-conference of ICON 3rd. We had this conference on 16 March this year, and Professor Jonathan be with us on 14 or 15 before the conference. So by that day, we also had the pre-conference. Okay, 16, the conference date, and today is post-conference of ICON 3rd. And we have hope to have the 4th ICON at BRU campus and again it would be a great honor for us to have Professor Jonathan as our guest speaker and keynote speaker. So let's say he's available for us or not. He's a very busy professor, actually. And he just asked me that only PhD student here attend this webinar. No, sir. We also have our academic partners from other universities, both from Thailand and overseas, from Vietnam, from Laos, PDR, etc. Wherever I publicize this webinar, and a lot of scholars interested in this, and they keep asking me to attend this. You are welcome. Free of charge for attending this webinar. It is very academically useful for everyone. The topic that will be delivered by Professor Jonathan also very interesting about TBLT and research in EFL classroom from theory to practice. It is very practical, and it is also very applicable to your current studies as well. So on behalf of BRU President, the HUSOC faculty, and also the PhD chair, I would like to thank you very so much, my PhD students from China, from Thailand and Myanmar. Crystal also here, Vivian from China, now they are in China, and some of them in Myanmar. And also our academic partners from other countries, from other universities. Thank you so much for your energetic participation in this webinar. Last but not least, please allow me to invite you to give a big round of applause to our guest speaker today, Professor Jonathan. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you. Please allow me to declare the webinar officially open. Thank you. ขอบคุณครับ
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
So I think I'll turn the stage to you now, Professor Jonathan, and we can't wait to listen to your lecture, please, sir.
Awesome. Thank you. And hello, everybody. It's great to be talking to you. It's great to see some familiar faces, you know, and thanks to Janak, you know, having visited Buriram, and so I can see some other very familiar faces there. Yeah. We've enjoyed some happy drinks in Wellington. And Crystal, I remember seeing you in last year, and others there as well. Ajahn Patanan and Mary. And others. So yeah, it's lovely to see your faces. You'll be getting a bit sick of seeing me, actually. So, you know, what do they say? Absence makes the heart grow fonder. I need to be more absent, otherwise you'll get bored with me. But let's just see how much I can keep your attention today. So here we are. I've got your attention theoretically for 2 hours, maybe not that long. We'll see how long it takes. And I've been asked to talk about this topic of TBLT and research in the classroom from theory to practice. And in the talk, I'm going to talk about 3 cases of research that I've supervised, which I think will be useful for PhD students. But if you're also a staff member involved in doing research and supervising research, I think this will also be useful for you. So I hope that you'll all find something of value here. Now, because some of you have heard me before, I'm trying not to repeat myself, but the topic does have some overlap with previous topics. So there might be some overlap, but maybe not too much. And even if there is overlap, you can just think about it as revision. Right? Refreshment and refreshing your knowledge of these topics. So here's my topic. TBLT and research in EFL classrooms from theory to practice. Now look at what I've written in red. Why have I written this in red? Oops, sorry. Anybody's welcome to talk. Do we always go from theory to practice? I don't think so. You know, when we're looking at research in classrooms, if we are teachers who are researchers, often our starting point is practice. Most of you listening to me, I would guess, have been teachers or were teachers before you were researchers. Is that right? Nod your head. Yeah. So most of us actually come from practice to theory and not theory to practice, right? And that's quite an important thing to keep in mind as I work through these slides, because our starting point is classrooms and how to understand classrooms and how to improve the quality of what goes on in classrooms. Yeah, okay. So just a bit of background about myself. This is the university I come from, Victoria University of Wellington. Some of you have experienced the university recently, and I wanted you to get your photo taken down here on the steps of our famous building. I'm not sure if you did, but anyway, this of course is Wellington, from looking down from the university across the city. It's just worth noting with respect to our university that with respect to Wellington, that it's famous for being a creative capital. Peter Jackson lives nearby, and many famous movies, The Hunger Games, Man of Steel, X-Men, Wolverine, Avengers, etc., have all had filming and digital work done on them through the studio here in Wellington. So we're quite famous for that work. Another brief point to note about the school that I'm a part of, the School of Linguistics and Applied Language Studies, is that we are, according to the current 2024 QS, 2023-24 QS subject level results, we're ranked 48th in the world in linguistics and applied linguistics, and first in New Zealand. So we have quite a strong international profile, and we have a lot of internationally renowned researchers who work and teach in the department. So that's us, and I'm really delighted, I must say, to have made this contact with your university. You know, and I hope this is a contact, before I go on, I hope that our contact can continue in coming years, and that we can strengthen our collaboration, because I was very impressed by your university, by the size and by the passion that you have as PhD students and as staff for engaging with quality research. One final thing to say is, just for those, you will all have masters and PhDs, but if you know any teachers in your countries who are interested in doing a master's, we offer a small number of scholarships, usually one scholarship per CMEO country, or actually RELC CMEO RELC in Singapore offer the scholarships to study in our program. So if you know teachers, early career teachers with a couple of years teaching who haven't got a master's, I would encourage you to encourage them to keep an eye out for those scholarships. A scholarship to study full-time in Singapore with all your expenses covered. It's a real privilege, and you know, it's a great honor for anybody who can get one of those scholarships. I guess also for me, just as I move in here, I'm going to start talking about TBLT in a minute, that here in New Zealand, we're rather well known for our contribution to task-based language teaching. Do you recognize any of the people in these pictures? Well, there's me. Perhaps the other most famous person. Do you recognize this person here? This is Rod Ellis, and this is Rosemary Earlham, and over here on the right is Martin East. Now, you know, we've all produced quite a lot of research in this field. Martin East's book on task-based language teaching from the teacher's perspective, my book on using tasks in language teaching, another of Martin East's books, Foundational Principles, of course, one of many of Rod Ellis's books, and Rosemary Earlham's recent book, Pedagogic Realities of Implementing Task-Based Language Teaching. So you can see that there's a lot of activity around task-based language teaching. And a lot of the activity which is taking place is about this topic of the pedagogic realities. there's been an increasing move in our field, and I think it's an exciting move, to understand practitioners' perspectives, to understand classrooms. Now, the early research in TBLT was very much research and theory-based. It came out of second language acquisition theory. But in the last 20 years, a lot of the research is seeking to understand tasks in context. So with that background in mind, here's what I'm going to talk to you about. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Oops, actually this, I'm just going to, bear with me. I've just realized there's something I need to change here. Just to make it a little clearer for us all. And because I'm a bit obsessive, oh, that should be like that. There we go. So, being and doing research, being and doing in research, 3 case studies, 1 quasi-experimental, 1 participatory action research, and 1 action research, and then final reflections and questions. And during the talk, I will open up the floor. If you've got questions, you can type them into the chat line, or you're welcome to speak. I love hearing people's voices. Okay, so that's what we're going to do. Being and doing research, 3 case studies, and then some final reflections. Hey, you. I'm trying to get your attention. Why are you here? Why are you spending your precious Saturday morning here? What do you want to get? Are you interested in research or teaching or both? You don't have to answer, but I want you to think. What questions would you like answered? Do you have any puzzles, any problems, any concerns? Something that you're curious about? As you will all know from learner-centered teaching, you need to engage your learners in thinking and constructing their knowledge of whatever it is they are learning about. And the same applies for us, that it's really useful for me if you come to this session with questions and with priorities. And find, oh, okay, that's all. Does anybody want to say anything at this point, or shall I move on?
Yes, Professor.
Mary?
Yes, you show on the PowerPoint, I see COSI experimental participatory action research, research. And I would like to know the difference between participatory action research and action research.
Mary, you just have to wait for that. That's coming. Okay, but I'm coming to that topic later. So yeah, we will learn about that later. Thank you for your question. Okay, you and research, being and doing. I want to start with this because, you know, we think of research as something we do, but actually research is something that we are, in the sense that when we do research, we take on an identity as researchers, right? So it's part of being, of reconstructing our image of who we are. And sometimes I think we look at research and we think about it as something which is outside of us and a long way away. But to be an effective researcher, I think you need to engage with the identity of owning it and saying, yes, I am a researcher. I am a curious person who is seeking to use research to understand the world. So in terms of being, you know, who are you as a researcher? Coming back to the theme of this talk, do you see yourself as a teacher who researches or a researcher who teaches?
Both, sir.
Both, yeah. So but you know, most of us, like I said before, I think most of us are teachers who research, but perhaps we move more into the researcher role as our careers grow. And so then we can, and we won't do this now, but I think all of us, as we go through our careers, as we do a PhD and move into lecturing positions, you know, we find that our relationship with research changes. It becomes part of our professional identity, and it also our work in research also shifts our notion of who we are as a practitioner. Now, this thing about identity is quite important, because if you do research but you struggle to get published, right, you end up with a fractured identity. You end up with an identity which can involve some fractures. It can involve some struggles and a sense of perhaps sometimes failure or not being adequate. And so the identity question is an important one, because we have to nurture our sense of identity and our sense of self by being part of a community of practitioners and a part of a community of researchers who support each other and look for opportunities to strengthen our confidence in our identity. I think we can bring the practitioner and the researcher together by thinking of practitioner research, which is what I'm interested in. Practitioner research is research in which teachers study themselves, their classrooms, and their impact on learning. So this is research that really seeks to bridge the gap between our two identities as researchers and teachers. And it's research that seeks to make a difference in the real world. It seeks to contribute to the quality of the experience of teachers, the quality of the experience of learners, and ultimately the betterment of our societies. So there's an ambitious, an ambitious role for us as researchers, ultimately making a contribution to the lives of the people in our communities. Capture and take a hold of that vision. You're doing a PhD for yourself, but ultimately to be really motivated, you need that bigger goal. And this is what Dick Allwright, a wonderfully insightful researcher, said about research, practitioner research. The aim is to understand life, not trying to solve problems, but to step back from them and see them in the larger context of the life and lives they affect. In short, it must contribute to the quality of life in the language classroom before it can hope to contribute to the quality of teaching and learning. So that's a truly aspirational goal for us, seeking to enrich the quality of life in the language classroom. And all of the research I'm going to share with you, I think, has that particular goal. And it's worth reflecting on this, each of us. To what extent are we contributing to the quality of life in the language classroom? And a final part about this before I move on to the case studies is, when you're thinking about what your research can contribute, this is a useful set of four sentence starters or clause prompts to help you articulate the purpose for your research. And so if you're a supervisor, you can get your PhD students to try and talk about this. I am interested in researching the topic of what? Using tasks to encourage primary school learners to be creative in their English classes, because I'm trying to show teachers how tasks can be a valuable resource in their classrooms, and so on. So you're looking at developing the rationale, and this will enable us, the significance This will enable us to improve the learning outcomes from primary school English classrooms in Thailand, and also to meet 21st century goals of creativity, collaboration, and critical thinking in the classroom. So, this is a useful set of prompts for reflecting about what your contribution is as a researcher. So research, being a researcher, and doing research. These two things are both bound into the set of prompts you see on the screen. All right, so I'm coming closer to the 3 case studies. When we're talking about doing classroom-based research, what are the usual steps? What do you start with? Well, you normally start with reflection on your teaching. You identify a problem. You read relevant research, develop a research question, conduct the research, disseminate the results. Am I missing anything there? So this is, if you remember, I added something to the topic for today's topic. It's not just theory to practice, it's also practice to theory. And you can see here the starting point is practice. It's my reflecting on teaching, identifying a problem in the real world, and then moving to theory, then moving in step 3 to the research, to the body of research, and then formulating a research question, conducting the research, and disseminating results. So let's look at these steps. Reflect on teaching. So who does the reflecting? Well, there's a number of options here. Obviously the teacher is one option, but it's not only the teacher. So if we think about who does the reflecting, and we can expand this question to think about research that is on English language teaching practitioners, or it's with practitioners, or it's by practitioners. So research that's on classrooms or on practice, is typically, can be ethnographic, or it can be quasi-experimental. Can be experimental, I suppose, not really. This is research in which the researcher is outside of the context and is looking in on it. So this is research on practitioners. Then we can think of research with practitioners. So the researcher works with the practitioners, and this is participatory action research, which I'll talk about soon. Maybe it's case studies where although I think we could argue that case studies also belong in the first category. So we're looking at research on the classroom. We're looking at research with teachers focused on the classroom. And then we're looking at research that is by teachers or practitioners. And this is action research or exploratory practice. I'm not going to talk about exploratory practice, but it's a very powerful model. And if you haven't heard about it, it's well worth asking ChatGPT to tell you a little bit more about exploratory practice, in particular Dick Allwright's work. It's distinguished from action research in that it doesn't start with a problem. It starts with curiosity. It starts not with trying to solve problems, but with trying to enrich our understanding of practice in classrooms and learners and teachers. So it's a lovely kind of complementary approach to research, which is not used enough. In fact, I was reading something recently. I've got it here somewhere. A key principle of teachers' exploratory practice is not to treat students as research participants, but to involve them as co-inquirers. And Rod Ellis says this: I first pointed to the advantage of exploratory practice in 2020. But to date, and this is in a journal that we are co-editors of, to date, we've received no articles reporting on this kind of practitioner research. This is a pity, we would welcome such articles. We would welcome articles that draw on the methodology of exploratory practice. So that's just a kind of a taster. If you want to understand exploratory practice, you need to go and find out about it. Okay. Thank you, Teachers Report. Now, I was just checking your chat line. So with this in mind, and you know, if you're doing a PhD, you might reflect on, where does your PhD sit? Is it in any of these categories, or is it somewhere else? Probably most of you are doing research on classrooms, but it would be lovely to see more research that is with the practitioners, collaborative, and by practitioners. And I'm going to share examples of each of these categories in the rest of my talk. But let me just go through these steps a little bit more. So we talked about the first step is reflecting on teaching, and it can be the teacher, or it can be a researcher, or it can be a combination of them both. Identify a problem and read relevant research. Why? One of the experiences I have with PhD students, they come to me with a problem, and then they want to move straight from the problem to the research question. And I say that's not going to work. Because if you've got a problem, the chances are many other people have experienced the same problem and have done research on it. So before you do any research, you need to find out, can you address your problem just by reading the existing research? Don't waste your time reinventing the wheel, as they say. So it's really important that this is why a literature review is a foundation for any research, and certainly for PhD research. The literature review has to take the starting point of the problem and pull in all the experimental evidence or research evidence that seeks to address that problem, and to critically reflect on that body of research, and then identify what still needs to be done. And then you're ready to ask your question and conduct the research. We come to step 6, and this is a problematic step. So, you know, many PhD students conduct the research and then have great problems disseminating the results. How do you disseminate results? Well, conferences, workshops, seminars in your university. But of course, most of you, all of you, I think, have to publish. And that's a problem. Getting published is a problem, and making the research that you have conducted available to other teachers is also a problem. In other words, accessibility. Much of the research that goes into Q1 and Q2 journals is behind a firewall. And so we have a problem with classroom-based research, which is deep and fundamental, that there's hundreds and hundreds of people, thousands of people, doing research on classrooms, getting their research published in journals, but it's not coming back to the teachers. It's not having an impact on the real world. And we've got a problem there. Until we have better accessibility for teachers, and until teachers are prepared to invest in accessing and making use of research, we continue to struggle with the divide between theory and practice. One of the positive things which is happening now is that there's an increasing move towards open access. So this is an example of a journal that I'm on the editorial board for. And you can see here that at least one of the articles in the preface, you can see the open padlock, which means these are open access. So you don't need to pay, you can access those articles. So there is a move to make research more accessible, but I think we're still a long way from bridging that gap between theory and practice, or between research and practice. That said, I want to share with you 3 studies that I think have successfully bridged that gap. Now, the first one is research on classrooms, research on a task-based approach to intercultural pragmatics. Okay, so I'm going to do 3 of these. Quasi-experimental, what does that term mean? If research is quasi-experimental, can anybody know? Can anybody recall the meaning of that term? Well, it means a couple of things. One, it means that there's an experimental dimension in that there will be a comparison group or a control group. So it has some kind of comparison. However, it's quasi-experimental in that there is not random assignment of participants to the experimental conditions. In other words, typically it involves working with intact classes. So you can't take learners from 5 different classes and randomize them, because this class will be one experimental condition, this class will be another experimental condition, and this class will be the control. So it's not truly experimental because you don't have random assignment of participants to the experimental conditions. And this is a very common approach to classroom research. It acknowledges that in the real world, we can't turn classrooms into laboratories, that there are real world constraints on the nature of research. So the study I'm going to share with you is this one by Priska Pramistiwa from Indonesia. It's kind of a long title. The effect of instructed intercultural pragmatics on the meta-pragmatic awareness and interaction of competence of tertiary Indonesian English academic purpose learners. Oof. There's a bit to unpack there. Let me give you an overview of this piece of research. And I'm doing this because I'm wanting to present to you some models of research at the PhD level that you might find useful in relation to tasks. So Priska worked in a teacher training program at a university in Indonesia, and she taught in an English conversation course, and the aim was to help the students become more communicatively, functionally proficient. The problem. Now, I think if you're in Thailand or China or Vietnam, you will experience similar problems. What do you think the problems might have been? Well, the course was taught by Indonesian nationals for whom English was an additional language. And they adopted a very monocultural approach to teaching pragmatics. That is to say, they used a textbook. They relied on the textbook to say that if you're in America, this is how you introduce yourself. This is how you do small talk. This is how you disagree. This is how you politely refuse or request, right? So it treated these acts of communication in a very monocultural way of simply learn the formulas that native speakers use, and that's enough. Now, it seemed to Priska, and certainly to us, that it's not clear if this approach meets the real world needs of learners. Why not? Why shouldn't the learners learn to talk like Americans? Well, when these graduates in Indonesia go into the workplace, so they might move into a company which is a global or an international company, who are they going to be working alongside? Well, their boss might be from China or Saudi Arabia or Switzerland. Their fellow workers might be from Myanmar, Malaysia, China, Philippines, right? So we have an intercultural space, and learning monocultural norms for pragmatics are a problem. So there's clearly room for change. And remember, we looked at the research steps. So this is Priska. you know, reflecting on teaching, identifying a problem, then doing a literature review. And then in literature review, she came across what she describes as instructed intercultural pragmatics. That is, deliberately explicitly helping learners to understand pragmatics in intercultural communication. Right. So this is what her PhD looked like. Phase 1, a situation analysis. She went back into her context, and because if I just go back here, that's not there. The initial reflection was anecdotal. So the problem space emerged from her anecdotal observations. And in research, we have to turn anecdotes into substantial evidence. So she went back and she did a much more careful analysis of the context. She interviewed stakeholders, employers, teaching staff, current students, graduates, and she asked them about their experience. But it was particularly useful to talk to graduates about how useful the course had been for them or not. And then she found that, and the things that we've talked about, that the learners' communicative needs were not met, that there was too much emphasis on Anglo norms, and the students really weren't equipped to be able to manage complex interactions in English with a range of interlocutors. So in phase 2, she did a quasi-experimental study in which she had an instructional intercultural pragmatics intervention. And she collected process data and pre-post data. And the intercultural intervention included introducing learners to a range of different ways of communicating, exploring the dynamic nature of culture, and getting learners to be reflective and to try things out and experiment rather than just learn a set of formula. So the experiment looked like this. 5 weeks, and you can see each week has a pragmatic theme, agreeing and disagreeing, making suggestions. There were 2 treatment groups, A and B, and they each went through the intervention, and there was a comparison group. So there were around about 20 in each of the 3 classes. All right. I'll talk about the differences between the 2 treatment groups in a minute. Now, this is more complicated than you need to know, but there were 3 pre-tests: an appropriateness judgment questionnaire, a reflective practice. I forgot what that was now. Can't remember that one. And a stimulated recall interviews. So 3 different pre-tests, and these were carried out again as post-tests. So we have this product outcomes measurement data. And she had process data in the form of weekly exit surveys. So at the end of each lesson, every learner had to fill out a 2-minute survey about their learning. All right, so across 5 weeks and 60-odd learners, she had quite a lot of, 5 weeks times 60 learners, 300 pieces of data, which looked at the process. And she also had recordings of what happened in the class. So very rich data. So that was her PhD. 2 phases. The first phase, situation analysis. Second phase, quasi-experimental study. A very strong PhD. You can see there's an awful lot of really rich data here. And no, I won't worry about that. So the treatment lessons that she taught in the instructed intercultural intervention involved, each lesson had a pre-task and then a task in which the learners did a task, planned together, then reported the results, and then there was a post-task meta-pragmatic discussion. The differences between the 2 groups are a little more complex than we need to deal with here. But it's interesting just to note that treatment group A focused on being reflexive, and treatment group B focused on being reflective. Now, this is quite an abstract distinction. Reflexivity, contemplating one's reactions and feelings. So when I experience communication with a native speaker of English, how do I feel about my feelings? If I experience a sense of judgment, for example, oh, that they're not very polite, being reflexive is noticing my feelings, noticing my judgments. And then being reflective, group B, is contemplating the situations outside of oneself. And self-reflecting on intercultural experiences. So it's a little bit abstract, and it doesn't matter too much. In terms of the findings, in terms of the exit slips, we found that in terms of referencing culture, that the reflexive and the reflective groups made much more references to culture than the comparison group. In terms of the judgment questionnaires, the reflective group made the greatest changes. In terms of the pre-post-test role plays, that's RP role plays, there was a considerable shift in the instructed pragmatics groups, but no change for the comparison group. And in the stimulated recalls, the reflective and reflective groups showed much greater awareness of options for how they could manage communication, whereas the comparison group showed much greater reliance on very narrow formulas. So that was her research. Now, contributions to research that I think are relevant to PhD students. Although it was a quasi-experimental study, notice that it had two phases. That the first phase involved going back into the context and testing her anecdotes, her anecdotal understanding, and collecting data to support her understanding of the situation. So she actually collected evidence from a range of stakeholders to establish that there really is a problem. Mixed methods research, so you see a nice combination of qualitative and quantitative research. And I'm not going to worry about that last point there. And her research provides evidence that teaching intercultural pragmatics is feasible and effective in a foreign language context. So there we have an example of quasi-experimental classroom research. It was rooted in a real-world problem that the teacher had identified, but it has contributions to make which are much more generalizable. It contributes to the field in terms of its research methodology, and it contributes to our understanding of pedagogy in terms of teaching pragmatics in foreign language contexts. So I'll just pause there. That's the first of 3 case studies, and ask if there are any questions. I'll just go back here to the research design. It seems to me that this is a research design which is replicable. Your focus may be on something different, but you notice it's got the key dimensions of quasi-experimental research. You've got comparison. You've got pre-post-test data, so you're measuring outcomes of an intervention. But there's also a lot of qualitative data. Recordings from the classrooms, weekly exit surveys, analysis of interactions that took place in the classroom and so forth. Okay. Right. So that's the first one. So when we've looked at one, I think you probably all need to just stop looking at the screen for a minute. You can check your Facebook page for a minute, check up with a friend, dream about dinner. Just give you a minute to step away from the screen. I'm going to do the same, and then we'll come back and we'll move on to number 2. Okay, are you ready for number 2? I'm going to stop
Um,
sharing for a minute. Just going to look at you all and see how you're getting on. 27, that's good. 26 minus me. What countries have we got here? So I can see lots from Thailand, of course. I can see China. Do we have anybody from Myanmar?
Yeah, from Myanmar, from Vietnam.
Where's somebody from Myanmar? Can you put your hand up or put your virtual hand up? Right.
Mary and that
Mary.
Yeah,
Mary, you're from, that's right. Hello, Mary. You're from Myanmar. And Yili Wang, I guess you're from China by the look of your name. And Crystal, you're from China. Vivian, where are you from? China, I think. Yeah, good. Good to see you again. Scott, where's Scott from?
Scott from China as well.
Ah, that's Scott. Right. I remember
Yeah.
Scott. Yeah. And Tindu from Vietnam. That's great. Okay. Okay, I can definitely know some. I definitely reckon. I can definitely see the faces behind some of these names, even if you're not showing your morning face. And I wonder where Sue is from. SU. Or on City, I guess. I don't know. On City, that's a Thai name. Okay, I'm just being curious here. Back to work, eh? Let's go. So, case study number 2. So the first one was quasi-experimental. The second case study is participatory action research on the emerging understandings and practices of TBLT by Thai EFL student teachers. Participatory action research it is action research, as the name suggests, PAR, in which the researcher, in which the teachers participate together, and typically in which there is also an external researcher who is working with them. So it's kind of action research, but with guidance structure. So this is a PhD study by Pawina Juritirapan, who's from the south of Thailand, and she did a fabulous PhD with me some years ago. And I shall share a little bit of it with you because we haven't talked about this PhD very much. So in terms of TBLT in Thailand, I could be wrong, but there's not a lot of TBLT research. There needs to be more coming from Thailand. And I'm perhaps a little bit out of date here, but there has been some research suggesting positive response from students and teachers at tertiary level from a couple of studies. Positive learning outcomes from task-based EFL courses at Thai universities, but quite limited research. And one study, which is now quite old, showing that primary school teachers were able to adopt task-based teaching with coaching. So, there's more research around probably, but not enough in Thailand. Is there a role for TBLT in Thailand? Well, as I understand it, and you will know better than me, but as I understand it, communicative competencies are prioritized in policy and curriculum initiatives. Your government wants Thai people to be able to communicate effectively in English. It's good for the economy. It's good for your global connectivity. And as I've said, there's some research that suggests that wider adoption of TBLT is feasible, but there's not much of it. And to our knowledge, there's no research in Thailand on learning about TBLT in pre-service teacher education. And it seems to me that's a big gap. It's a big gap around the world, and it's a big gap in Thailand. And it's a gap that we need more research on. So if you're looking for a topic, look at pre-service teacher education. So Pawina's study was 2-phase. In phase 1, she introduced a module on TBLT in year 4 of a teacher education program at the university, and she tracked the learning of the student teachers. ST stands for student teachers. Okay, so when the student teachers learned about TBLT academically as part of a course on teaching methodologies. She looked at what they picked up, what they learned, using interviews and their assessed work on the course. And then in phase 2, she followed 3 of the teachers into their practicum and looked at the extent to which there was any evidence of TBLT in their practice. What do you think she found? Sue is from Thailand, thank you. Right. Well, let's look at what she found. I mean, maybe before we look at what she found, can you see again where this research starts from? It doesn't start from theory. It starts from a teacher reflecting on her practice. Pawina reflecting on, we've got these teachers, these student teachers that come through, and they go into schools and they just teach the same old way. How can we help them become better communicative teachers? That was the problem. The literature review indicated that there wasn't much research to help us with this problem. So she had a great topic to look at. This is what her study looked like. So a pre-course survey, a 5-week module on TBLT, a post-course survey, focus group interviews. So that's getting an understanding of the uptake or learning from the academic module, and then going into the practicum in the following year. She did a pilot study to start with. And then there were 3 cycles whereby she first observed the teachers planning their lessons and teaching their lessons without intervening. Cycle 1. Cycle 2, she worked with the teachers to help them be better at incorporating principles from TBLT. And in cycle 3, she observed them again, planning and teaching their lessons, but she didn't intervene. And she had case studies of 3 teachers, and that was her Ph.D. And these are her questions for phase 2. So how did the student teachers' understandings and practices change as they learnt to teach? What factors influenced their behavior? And how did the learners respond to the lessons? So the practicum took place in a secondary school. There were 3 different classes. These classes, as you know, if you're from Thailand, were quite large, 35 to 40 students, and they had 3 lessons a week. And this is the textbook they used. Is anybody in this webinar session familiar with this book? Anybody? No? This is what it looks like. This is a lesson. So you can see it's very much PPP focused, presentation of the grammar, a practice of the grammar, and then production, number 8 down here, where the learners get to actually do something communicative. So, you have got sort of tasks. Step 8 is a kind of a task. I think probably 7 is an input-based task. So 7 and 8 are tasks, although this is not really task-based learning. It's task-supported language teaching, because there's so much emphasis on grammar before the learners communicate. So that's the kind of textbook they were using. So there is, and down here, there's kind of an input-based task where the learners have to do a survey. They have to do a quiz. So there's quite a lot here which is communicatively oriented and which could be strengthened. And there's quite a lot here which is like tasks. And therefore has the potential to help teachers be tasked. Yes, thank you, Chuck James. You're familiar with that book. So this was a multiple case study, 3 female student teachers, and the data collection involved observing lessons, interviewing each teacher 3 times, and a learner focus group from each class. Okay. Again, I'm trying to give you a model of a solid piece of classroom research, which you could do for a PhD, or if you are a staff member looking for a new research topic for yourself, or research model, this is a model that you could consider. And then she did a thematic analysis of the data. So qualitative analysis of the data using thematic analysis. So just to reiterate what happened in the observation cycles, she went into the schools and observed the students planning their lessons and teaching the lessons in the first observation cycle. Observation cycle 2, she actually worked with the teachers to strengthen the task-based dimensions of their teaching and then observed them teaching those lessons. And then in observation cycle 3, she again observed the teachers planning their lessons and teaching their lessons, but did not contribute to the lesson planning. So she wanted to see whether her support in OC2 led them to be different in the way they planned in OC3, right? So some really interesting stuff going on. So how did the student teachers' understandings and practices of TBLT change? Well, in the first cycle, 6 of the 12 lessons they taught had no interactive activities at all. Teacher-centered, all textbook-based, and they avoided any kind of interactive activities that were in the lesson. In other words, if there were tasks in the lesson, these teachers avoided them. The other 6 lessons had some interactivity. 4 were from the textbook and 2 were from the internet, but they were language practice games. They weren't actually tasks. So group-based crosswords or a question and answer game or a vocabulary bingo game. So these were, a step forward, but they were very conservative and they weren't tasks. In terms of interviewing the teachers, they didn't mention tasks at all, although a couple of the teachers did talk about group work and interactive games and activities. And you can see that ploy her when she was asked what a task is. She said that any activities that activate learners' interaction are tasks, which I would suggest is a misunderstanding of what a task is. So in terms of the first observation cycle, the teaching was teacher-centered and forms-focused. There were very modest attempts to be communicative language teaching, very modest. And the textbook was detasked. In other words, the interactive activities in the textbook were typically not used. Little evidence that they had learned anything or were able to apply anything from the Year 4 methodology course. And there was a lack of awareness of learner-centered communicative language teaching as promoted in the curriculum. In the second observation cycle, where Hawena worked to plan the lessons and revise the lessons so that they were more strongly task-based, we see that there were 2 trajectories. Ploy became a confident task-based implementer, but Ta and Nan struggled, although they showed some progression over the 3 lessons. For Ploy, all 3 lessons were interactive and learner-centered. She implemented tasks with ease, and she included a language focus in the post-task phase. So this is a really interesting result, right? We're seeing a teacher, a student teacher in the early days of their teaching, shifting from teacher-centered to learner-centered with mentoring and support. In terms of her understanding, she came to see that TBLT involves group work and interactive activities, and that the explicit grammar focus can be left until the end of the lesson and not the start of the lesson. For teacher Ta, she was nervous about implementing interactive tasks. She forgot the teaching sequence, had difficulty giving instructions. And we can see here, I was afraid of making mistakes. And so she was nervous. And of course, this is understandable for a novice teacher. In lesson 5, she didn't finish making the teaching aids in time, so she fell back on translation and felt relaxed and confident when teaching in a teacher-centered way. In lesson 6, she actually worked through the task-based lesson smoothly and understood the roles, task-based roles of facilitating and supporting. And so you can see some emerging understanding. through these 3 lessons, she really struggled and she kind of failed in lesson 4, failed in lesson 5, but by lesson 6 was starting to develop as a task-based teacher. Some lesson reflections that align with task-based language teaching. 2 of the teachers associated it with collaborative work, with real-life use of language, with learning by doing, and with the 3-stage framework: pre-task, task, post-task. Self-directed learning, post-task phase for working on grammar, and tasks do not need to be big projects. So some interesting observations coming through here. Observation cycle 3. This is where the teachers planned their next set of lessons without Pawina helping them. So all 9 lessons were interactive, made more use of pair work, and the post-task focus on form. So that was a positive thing that's happening here. Focus on form was taught communicatively, although the interactive activity still focused on grammar rather than communication. So in the lesson reflections by the 3 teachers, 3 aspects of TBLT were mentioned: the 3-stage framework, pre-task, task, post-task; learner-led discovery, so allowing the learners to discover things through using language; and realization that this is interesting, realization that you don't have to design detailed, complex resources, that you can do a task quite simply. So a summary: in the first observation cycle, there was very little evidence that learning about TBLT made any difference. Even with expert guidance, 2 of the teachers really struggled to implement TBLT, but they improved with practice. And they all developed an expanded understanding of TBLT. And by the 3rd cycle, all 9 of their lessons involved interactive learning activities. Although there was no mention of the 4 task features of a primary focus on meaning, some kind of gap, learners using their own resources, and a communicative outcome. So they hadn't really grasped the essence of what a task is, but they'd made some significant progress. So this is a really interesting piece of research that shows how student teachers can be mentored and supported to move from teacher-centered to learner-centered teaching, from forms-focused, grammar-focused teaching to more communicative teaching in a relatively short period of time. So on the one hand, we see here a curriculum imperative for learner-centered communicative teaching in Thailand. There's a textbook which actually describes itself as task-based, although it's not. Very strong encouragement, which I haven't mentioned before, but there was very strong encouragement from the supervising teachers to be creative with the textbook and use it any way they wanted to. And learning about TBLT as part of their teacher education. So these were all the positive factors. And also there was positive in year 4. They evaluated their experience of learning about TBLT positively. On the other hand, the less positive things, that there was a tendency for the teachers initially to detask the textbook lessons. This shouldn't be a reply. A tendency to use teacher-centered forms-focused lessons. When they did interactive activities, they typically focused on practicing grammar, and there was little explicit reference to principles from TBLT. However, as we've seen, the teachers grew in confidence and the ability to implement learner-centered interactive activities, and by the end, they reported a deeper understanding of learner-centered teaching. So some real progress here, even though there was a long way still to go. Well, so what? Well, I probably should ask you, so what? Is any of that interesting? What do you think? Does it surprise you? Do you like the research design? And if so, what do you like about the research design? Or do you not like the research design? Or do you have any questions about the research design or criticisms? This is the joy of Zoom, isn't it? If we were together in a big room, I'm sure you would all be busy talking by now. Maybe I could put you into chat. Maybe I could put you into breakout rooms. I'm tempted. I'm tempted. Yeah. What do you find? I'm going to stop talking for a minute. I'm going to put you into breakout rooms just for a few minutes, just to have a chat if I can just find my breakout rooms. Where's it gone? Oh, I'm in somebody else's. I don't have access to breakout rooms because I'm in somebody else's Zoom. It's not my own Zoom. Ajahn Ek, have you got any way that we can do breakout rooms? Can you give? Can I? I'll claim host.
Kabirapap, please inform Ajahn Cherlimkiat about this. Yes, Ajahn Cherlimkiat is the host of this Zoom link.
I might be able to make myself the host. I've lost you. Nope, I can't make myself the host. Well, look, I think we won't do that then because it's going to take too much time. So, since we're not going to do breakout rooms, I would like one person to say something about what we've looked at so far. We've looked at 2 case studies. One was quasi-experimental, and one was kind of participatory action research / case study. What have you noticed or learned or thought was interesting? Or do you have any questions? One person. You can say anything you want. I just want to hear another voice and not my voice for a change.
I think Crystal can raise some questions.
Crystal, hello.
Hello, dear professor. We are very lucky to listen to your lecture again. Yeah, very, very happy and lucky. Just now, I heard the two cases of the research. I think for the quasi experiment, I knew some, but not very good at it. So I think I need to read more and to learn more. And for the participatory research, it's new to me. Because in the past, I just know something about observation, and I tried to take notes of some observations, but I don't know how to take it into my research. But after I heard your lecture, I think I had some ideas now. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Crystal.
Sorry, and I have my own question. That is, at the very beginning of your lecture, you told us how to begin our research. For example, I'm interested in what and because what, and so on. My question is that I'm very interested in reading instruction, and I talked it with you last time when we met.
and it gave me some help and it gave me some resources to read. But my question is that I'm interested in reading instruction because I want to motivate my students to read more. Because I teach college English in China, and for my teaching, it's teacher to a large extent, it's teacher-centered, and students passively read. They just read for tests. They just read for the exam. So I want to motivate them. So in my research, I want to involve motivation. I want to research the motivation, students' motivation, and reading instruction. But I'm not sure. I read a lot, but I can't put them together and get some new ideas about teaching, how to teach reading to motivate my students to read more actively.
Okay, good.
Thank you.
So what you've got there, if we think, and I'm not going to spend too much time on this, Crystal, because this is your particular area, but we've got two dimensions of what you're talking about. Number one is, what's the nature of the problem? So you've identified a problem that your learners are not motivated to read, but I think you've got to dig into the nature of that problem more deeply. And then the next step, of course, is to go into the literature and identify what are the proposed solutions to the problem of motivating learners to read more. Now, you know, the solutions, it seems to me, that you could try out involve, one, what they read, how they read, where they read, and the role of the teacher. And now you might want to look at each of those dimensions and say, okay, so what are they reading? And is that the problem? Or how are they reading? Are they reading, you know, and what is the, you know, what are they reading in terms of, is it interesting, but also is it at the right level? If they are reading the material that is too difficult, they won't enjoy it. So does it make a difference if they read simpler material? What activities in the classroom are associated with reading? Can we provide a more interesting approach to instructed reading in the classroom that actually models happiness and joy and excitement and engagement when you read? Because the classroom is where you model literacy development. So you've got these kind of, you know, looking for different solutions to the problem, and then looking at what the research literature tells us about those solutions. Okay, that's the first thing. The second thing is then to think about your research design, you know, and one of the designs you might explore is, well, what about a quasi-experimental study where one group of learners gets to try out reading different kinds of material, and another group of learners reads the same old material. At the end, you pre and post test their attitudes to reading and how much they read, and you pre-test their reading comprehension. Another kind of study might be participatory action research, where you actually look more qualitatively at the experience in the classroom. So you look at a more qualitative study of what's actually happening in the classroom. In terms of the exploratory research, it seems to me that at least part of your research should be seeking to understand why it is that learners are not motivated. In other words, that's going to involve interviews, maybe surveys, observations, triangulation of data from those different sources to understand the problem. And Crystal, that's why when pretty much all of my PhD students do two-stage or two-phase studies. The first phase is to understand the situation more deeply. So you've got a problem with motivation, go back and understand it better. Talk to the learners, find out what they do, get them to do a reading log, and then track their progress and so forth. And then the second stage is to do something which involves an intervention. The intervention can be participatory, or it can be quasi-experimental, or it can be action research. And action research is what I'm going to talk about next. So I'll move on to the next part of my talk because we're going to run out of time. Is that okay?
Oh, yeah, thank you, Professor. Thank you very much.
Okay. Then Vu, yes, you talked about the proficiency level of the students in the chat line, and that's a good point. The proficiency level of students does make a difference, but I have to say that teachers often treat this as an excuse. I don't mean to criticize teachers, but teachers say, "Oh, I can't teach communicatively because my students are not strong enough," which is a misunderstanding. You can teach the first lesson that your students ever take with English can be communicative. You can communicate with 20 words. You can do little fun games and activities, you know. So I think it's a mistake to think that learners have to be proficient to communicate. The key thing for teachers is to structure the communication to suit the level of the students. You know, so you can do a simple class in your beginning learning English class. You know, learners can do a simple game, simple task where they move around, introducing themselves or maybe ask each other, "How old are you?" They don't even have to understand the grammar. Just, "How old are you?" And then they just learning the numbers. "I'm 16. I'm 17. And they go around and they take the numbers. Yeah, you've got a task right there. Anyway, Jonathan Newton shall continue talking. If he can find his screen. Here we go. So where were we, folks? We were in Thailand, right? We were in a secondary school where we had 3 young teachers learning to teach. And we saw that with help, they became more able to teach interactive lessons aligned with task-based principles. So what? Well, the first thing to note is that the textbook and the tasks in the textbook and the communicative curriculum were not having the desired effect on teaching practice. A second thing that we observed was that there's a slightly problematic association of TBLT with interactive games and language practice, but not with genuine language use. So, for example, you could have an interactive vocabulary game where students would run up to the board and write a word, right? Or an interactive pronunciation game, and the teachers would call it a task. Well, it's not a task. It's a language practice activity. And that's fine, nothing wrong with it, but it's not a task. And so teachers have to learn about that a task is much more than just interaction or language practice. It's about getting learners to use the language to achieve something. And naturally, for student teachers, the main thing they're thinking about is how to manage the class and how to manage themselves. So it's very hard to do something like task-based language teaching. And as a result, you know, non-native speaker student teachers are likely to feel especially vulnerable if they allow too much communicative freedom, because they lose control and they might not be confident about their own communicative proficiency in English. And I've just got an interesting comment there too from Yutichak. Yeah. So I think it's a very good point that there's the tasks in the textbooks often take too much time, and so teachers skip these. But Yatichok James, sorry if I mispronounced your name, if I can just respond to that comment. In the observations that my students have done, the teachers spend so much time doing grammar activities, and I ask the question, why can't the learners do the grammar activities later? Because you don't need to be in a class to do grammar or vocabulary activities. So perhaps there needs to be a reprioritization. But I take your point, and I think what we need to do is we need to work out ways to do really short tasks simple and short, rather than thinking that a task has to be a whole, 45-minute activity. I think the key question is, do my learners have rich opportunities to function, not as learners, but as language users? If they don't, then there is a big gap in their education. If teachers say there's not enough time, then you will continue in a place like Thailand to have underperforming students across the country in English. And I know if you look at Thailand, that you don't do particularly well, that there's potential for a lot of growth in the communicative outcomes from English language teaching. Number 3, the last one, and then we'll wrap up. So where have we been so far? Case study 1, what country? Somebody shouted out.
Indonesia.
Indonesia.
Yes.
Case study 2?
Thailand.
Thailand. Case study 3? New Zealand.
Oh.
So this is Yoshie Nishikawa, and Yoshie-san, one of my PhD students. She's a lecturer here at the university, and she teaches beginner level Japanese at Victoria University. And I'm going to use her PhD as an example of action research at PhD level. Is anybody here interested in action research? Sometimes people ask the question, or they say, oh, you can't do action research for a PhD, right? And you know what I say? Rubbish. Of course you can. Action research and classroom research is a very strong, very powerful model, and entirely appropriate if it's done at the right level of depth and richness for a PhD. So, Yoshie has been teaching beginner level Japanese at university for some years, and she's become very interested in TBLT. She wanted to make her classes more interesting. So this is kind of like the exploratory practice model, and she wanted to bring TBLT into beginner level Japanese classes. The context was only 1 hour a week of oral communication tutorials, beginner level, and a very strongly grammar-based textbook. So this is a big challenge. If your teachers in Thailand think that it's difficult to teach English communicatively in Thailand, you try teaching Japanese, with a character-based language. Try teaching Japanese using tasks to absolute beginners. Well, that's what she wanted to do. So this is what her PhD looked like. Now you'll see something that is common to every one of the 3 studies in this diagram. What can you see that I have talked about already? Over here in the blue, every study begins, if it's a classroom-based study, folks, the study begins by going back into the setting and doing a rigorous analysis, investigation of your teaching situation as a researcher. So you initially identify the problem as a teacher, you take your teacher hat off, you put your researcher hat on, and you go back and you collect more data to understand the situation. So she did that in the first phase, and then she went through these cycles over a whole semester of planning each week, acting, observing, reflecting, and then planning again. So this is across, I think, 10 weeks, so 10 cycles. And this is her PhD. Fantastic PhD. One of the most interesting PhDs I have had the privilege of supervising. So here's what the textbook looks like. And this is the textbook activity for the oral tutorial. Well, You can see it's all about grammar. Tell what Mary is good at using. She's good at tennis, and this is what it says. She's poor at swimming, so they've simply got to take these terms here, Spanish, cooking, making sushi, and put them into the sentence and practice the sentence. So in terms of analyzing whether this is a task, there's no meaning focus at all. There's no gap, because we know what's good, we know what's poor. The learners don't use their own resources at all, and there's no outcome. It's purely practicing language to practice language. So here's how she changed that activity. She created a role play in which learners worked in pairs. One member of the pair was a careers advisor, and one was an advisee. And they asked questions. The advisee answers, and the advisor identifies which job would be good. Okay, so it's pair work, role play. Let's have a look at what it looks like. So here's the task sheet that she designed. Beginner level learners of Japanese. So this is what the career advisor's interview sheet is like. So she's got a sentence structure, right? And then she asks in Japanese, do you like working outdoors? And the student says yes or no. If they say yes, they say, well, do you like speaking Japanese? If the advisee says, yes, I do, I like speaking Japanese. Do you like playing sport? Yes, I like playing sport. And therefore, I would advise you to be an athlete. Let's try another one. And so this is that doing this in Japanese. Do you like working outdoors? No, I don't like working outdoors. Do you like using a computer? Yeah, no, I don't like using a computer. Do you like cooking? No, I don't like cooking. Well, I would advise you to be a hairdresser. I don't know how you get to being a hairdresser. But you can see that, you know, this is the activity she designed for these students, and they had such fun. Now, these are beginners. Let's do the task analysis. Meaning focus? Sure. The advisee has to listen and think about, do I like working outdoors? Yes or no? Do I like driving for a job? Yeah, yes or no? Is there a gap? Sure, because the advisee doesn't know what job they're going to be advised about. Do they have to use their own resources? Well, not so much, because there's a lot of support here. But there is some use of own resources in completing the full sentences. And is there an outcome? Absolutely. The career advisor advises the advisee on the best job for them based on their preferences. Right? A really fun little activity. Now, own resources is the one that we have a slight problem with. And here's where Yoshie struggles. So again, remember, this is about action research. She's designing these materials for the class and trying them out and reflecting on them. And she says, well, own resources. And part of her insight that I think is generalizable and useful for other teachers is that she struggled with what it means to design a task for learners who have limited language resources. Well, here's the insight. One, you can give the learners some vocabulary. That's no problem. But the learners still have to choose how to use the vocabulary. So before they did the task, the learners had a mini vocab quiz to learn about the Japanese words for hairdresser, driver, outdoors, cook, teacher, and so on. Grammar items can be borrowed. So she did an input-based task in which these questions were part of the input task. Searching for words is part of the learner's non-linguistic resources. So if learners have to look at the dictionary, ask the teacher, that's fine. That's great, because the learners are collecting, mining, gaining the resources they need to do what they need to do. And finally, the task ended in grammar explanation and drills at the end. And so these are the 4 insights that Yoshie gained to answer the question at the top of the page. And I'm just going to turn on my heater because it's getting cold. We're getting towards the end. What did the students think? So another dimension I should highlight with all of these research studies, and I think this should be true of most research in classrooms, is that you are drawing data from different sources, right? So you've got these, it may be mixed methods or it may only be qualitative, but you've got triangulation of data from different sources. So she had students talk, she asked students about their experience of the lesson. And here's some of the things they said. We practiced a lot of vocab in a realistic way. They liked that. The engaging activity towards learning how to use whatever that is. I liked working with others because they were really helpful. So the students found that when they were given an opportunity to help each other fill in the gaps in their linguistic knowledge, they really liked that. You know, there's a funny principle about being a human being, that people help people who need help. Yeah? People need help people who need help. But on the negative side, some students said, I couldn't remember vocab and verbs we just went over. So some students found that difficult. And I found it difficult to put words into proper sentences right away when talking. So, you know, the students gave her some very interesting insights as well. And here's where we come to what I would describe as the autoethnographic dimension of Yoshie's journey. So autoethnography is a growing approach to research. Autoethnography is that when we do an ethnography of ourselves. And so I think Yoshie's Ph.D. is a combination of action research and autoethnography, where she's being very reflective about her own journey as a teacher who is learning to be a task-based teacher. And that autoethnography is a very beautiful, reflective, rich story of teacher learning. Crystal, can you imagine that you're Yoshie and could you read this? You can pretend that you're Yoshie and you read this. Yeah, I used to tell.
Sorry, Professor, my internet connection is not very good just now. Would you please?
Yeah, I'm ready, dear Professor.
Who's that?
Yeah, I used to tell my students that the classrooms are the place for them to make plenty of mistakes so that they will not make mistakes in real life when they have a chance to speak with native speakers.
Okay, carry on.
But I have a totally different view now from then. Language use is happening here right now. They use the language with their classmates and teachers, not as a learner, but as a language user in the real communication.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, carry on.
In the real communication events.
Marvelous, thank you. And you're from Myanmar?
Yes, dear Professor.
Marvelous, thank you. So just pause and look at that.
Excuse me?
Everybody, just everybody, thank you. So you can see, I don't know if you can understand what she's saying, but she's saying there's been a shift in her understanding of what the purpose of the class is. Initially, she thought, sure, in the class you can make mistakes because outside the classroom you can speak with native speakers, and that's when you can really use the language. But then she's thinking from a task-based perspective, actually what they do in the classroom is using the language. They're using it now. They're not just learners, they're users. And so she shifts her perspective on who the learners are. They're not learners, they're users in this particular context. They're a combination of both, of course. And that was her, wonderful insight. one of her many insights. And so the point I want to make to you is that here we see another approach to research in which the teacher as researcher is using their own teacher learning, their own journey as a teacher as the focus of their research, right? They're telling their own story, and that story is a legitimate focus and topic of research. I want to just expand on this a little bit more and show you how Yoshie structured the nature of her research, because I think this is very interesting for those of you who are interested in classroom research and qualitative classroom research. So look at this complicated diagram. So each week she ended up with a weekly story, which was about 3,000 words. It was a beautifully written story, which she then shared with me. Where did the story come from? Well, let's go down to the bottom. To begin with, she made quick notes when she was teaching, and she sort of immediate reflective notes straight after the class, and then a few bit of sort of free thinking writing, free writing. So these are just her really rough notes as she journaled. She then had reflective conversations with me. She wrote a reflective journal drawing on these three things. And she looked at the student data. She looked at what they produced in the classroom, what they said about their learning, and how they performed. And then all of these things together were threaded into what became a weekly story. And so we have these two processes of journaling, just using journaling to get your ideas onto paper, and then taking those ideas and what's called restorying the ideas, turning them into weekly stories. And those weekly stories, 10 of those stories, 3,000 words each, 30,000 words, that is the center of her thesis, right? So I hope you're seeing that I'm sharing a couple of things with you. I'm sharing how to do research in the classroom, but also what a thesis might look like that comes from this kind of research. This notion of restoring comes from Gary Buckhuizen, University of Auckland, up north of me here in New Zealand. And he identifies three levels at which we tell stories in research. The first level is a lowercase s. So these are reflective journals of what happens in a lesson. The inner circle is a lesson. And then we turn these into sort of bigger stories of our lives as teachers, the weekly stories. And then we have this uppercase stories, which is a thematic analysis of the themes that came out. So you remember, if we go back here, this is this is the biggest story. This is one of the themes that came out at the level of stories. Okay, so starting with the small story of what actually happened, kind of making sense of the story at a slightly larger level, and then looking at the themes that are relevant to other teachers as well. So Yoshie concluded by seeing her work in the Ph.D. doing action research, leading her to a deeper understanding of the classroom. And that led her to develop her identity as a researcher and to grow her research. But it also led her to improve the quality of what she's doing in the classroom. In other words, she saw herself developing not just as a teacher, but as a change agent, as somebody who's actually transforming the experience of the learners in the classroom and transforming her own experience of what it means to be a teacher. I see the time is running out. So just a quick reflective pause. Looking out across the South Island here towards my hometown. In the mist over there somewhere is my hometown of Nelson. This is about 9 p.m. in the evening in November last year. And this is my son, Max, and his partner enjoying a paddle in the sea after a long day's biking together. Max and Jem. Okay, where to from here? I think I'm going to skip over this because time's running out. Task research needs to explore diverse contexts, and I've explored 3 contexts with you. Number 1, Indonesian EFL classes for students who are studying business English and business, doing a degree in business, or so they're non-majors. Second study was a study of teacher education, teacher educators, novice teachers in Thailand. And the third study was in Japanese beginner classes at Victoria. So to become a research pedagogy, many more studies are needed into the actual use of tasks in authentic classrooms, in different contexts, different continents, different kinds of language learners and teachers, and in different kinds of programs. And I hope I've showed you some evidence that supports Chris van der Branden's suggestion or call for a greater range of research. And I hope that each of you listening to this talk is also making a contribution to a particular context or drawing on a particular context in a particular country with a particular type of language learner in a particular type of program. In other words, we still need research on how tasks work, for whom they work, where they work, when they work, and why they work. And not just tasks. It can be, as Crystal's talking about, reading. How do we make reading work? How do we help learners with writing? So, whatever you want to focus on fits in there. I think a particularly useful tool that we can draw on in qualitative research is micro-evaluation of tasks, in which we turn to the learners and draw our evidence of the impact of tasks from the learners. So, for example, we can look at the question of how the learners experience whatever the innovation is, if it's tasks, or Crystal, if it's reading. How do the learners perceive the experience of learning to read in this way or doing a task? Were they motivated? Did they enjoy it? So student-based data collection involving self-report from the learners, exit slips, surveys, interviews, post-lesson reflections. Exit slips, if you're not familiar, that simply is 3 minutes at the end of the lesson where all the learners log into a website, or they can do it on paper, but they've just got a quick survey and they've just got to type in what they learned, what they liked, what they didn't like. See you tomorrow. The learner performance. How did they do? Did they read as much as you'd expected? Did they do the task as expected? So this is what's called response-based data collection. And you can record what happened. You can use observation checklists as a teacher. You can look at their written responses. You can record how well they interacted in groups as you walk around and observe them. So you're looking at their response to the activity in the class. And finally, and more ambitiously, we need to understand, what have they learned? What evidence can we collect that what we did in the class actually led to learning? Now, again, we typically use pre and post tests for this, but they can be limited. They can be difficult to interpret. Some other alternatives are uptake charts. An uptake chart is where you identify for the learners, for example, it might be, you might have 3 areas that you wanted the learners to have learned something. You might have pronunciation, vocabulary, communication strategies, whatever they are. And you give each learner a chart with these 3 categories. And the learners have to write, what did I learn about pronunciation? What did I learn about vocabulary? What did I learn about strategies, or about whatever it is? And this is called an uptake chart. And there's been some quite interesting research showing that the results are surprisingly reliable. That what learners intuit or identify as their learning achievements are reasonably accurate. And of course, you can transcribe. If it's group work, you can actually look at what learners said and did. There are many qualitative research options for researching tasks. Which ones have we covered today? Well, we've kind of looked at a mixture of sort of case studies. I would argue that Pawina's research in Thailand, 3 case studies, but it was also participatory action research. So it was a combination of those 2 things. Action research, Yoshie. Autoethnography was Yoshie. To some extent, Yoshie also was using narrative inquiry because she was using action research, a combination of action research and her reflective autoethnography to write a narrative. So she reported her findings as a sequential narrative of learning across the teaching of 10 weeks of a course. And so we could perhaps even argue that that's a longitudinal study as well. So you can see that these are not necessarily separate. And the one I've forgotten to mention here, of course, is the first one, which is quasi-experimental research. I think 3 tips to almost finish with for contextually relevant research. The point I made earlier, that most of my PhD students do 2-phase research. They do a situation analysis, and then they do some kind of intervention. The good thing about doing this is you can usually get at least 2 publications, because the situation analysis can lead to a publication, and that publication can be worked on and published in the first 2 years of the PhD. When studying what teachers think and know and understand and believe and value, remember that teacher cognition is not just in the head, it's also in action. So we always need to link what they say they believe with what they actually do. I think close analysis and thick description of cases reveals unique development trajectories. So I'm a great believer in really detailed, rich case studies. I think they're very powerful. And those 3 case studies that Pawina carried out of those 3 novice teachers were very interesting, showing the different trajectories that each student teacher was moving along as they learnt to teach. So to conclude, I'm just going to skip over that. Am I going to skip over that? I'll let you read it. So you'll see that all 3 studies I have introduced you to involve teachers' voices. We began this talk by talking about, research on teachers, with teachers, and for teachers, or by teachers. And all of those types of research allow us to hear the teachers' voices. And these can help us humanize and shape our pedagogic futures and bridge the gap between research and practice, because the teachers are deeply involved in the research. I think that's a very powerful way forward. Just a note to finish on, there are 3 free books. That's a tongue twister. 3 free books on TBLT that I would recommend. I've given you the QR code for Rod Ellis's book because it's very hard to find that book, but with the QR code you can find it. Highly recommend those 3 books, Daniel Jackson's, Martin East's, and Rod Ellis's books. And I'll share my slides. If anybody wants to travel to Japan in July, you don't have to hear me again, but you will hear the fabulous John Norris and the fabulous Shoko Sasayama and many other fantastic speakers at the 5th biennial conference of the JALT TBLT SIG. This is a fantastic conference. They have the best speakers. They've had Peter Skian, Rod Ellis, Jane Willis, many famous speakers at this conference. So if you want to go to Japan for a bit of a break in July, I'd love to see you there. And on that note, I want to thank my 3 wonderful PhD students, Pawina, Yoshie, and Prishka, Club, and open up the floor for questions, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Jonathan. We have some questions in the chat box.
Okay, I'll look at them.
Yes, the first one, I think it's since the books that you mentioned to us, the textbook used PPP model. I wonder how a sample treatment session was like to illustrate TBLT in practice.
So the textbook used is PPP. Yes, it is. I just wonder how a sample treatment session was like to illustrate TBLT in practice. So that's a good question. So what Pawina did with the teachers was she got them to begin the lesson with a task, because the PPP starts with lots of grammar, right? Lots of grammar practice and things. And she moved the grammar practice to the end, and she looked at the activities, the task activities, and she moved them earlier in the lesson with some support. So that was one of the ways that they changed, they made the PPP textbook more task-like. And that's a way that Jane Willis recommends that teachers can respond to PPP, that they can spend less time teaching the grammar at the beginning and more time doing something interactive, and then introduce the grammar towards the end. The second, what's the next question there? Yatachak James, my general comment on Thai textbooks, the design lessons in the books is more time. Yeah, I've already talked about that. How does TBLT address the needs of diverse learners and learning styles? Well, first of all, so how does TBLT address the needs of diverse learners? First of all, I think learning styles is a myth. So I don't have any confidence that there's anything relevant to be concerned about with learning styles. We're all visual, we're all kinesthetic, we're all audio, we've all got ears, we've all got eyes, we've all got mouths, we've all got bodies. And I think it's a mistake to think that you need to somehow have some activities for some learners and other activities for other learners. What you should be doing is making sure that every lesson involves the learners listening, speaking, using their bodies. Great, very simple, right? Just make sure learners are moving, make sure learners are being creative, make sure they are reading, make sure they are listening. Some people say, oh, I'm a very visual learner. Well, actually, frankly speaking, in learning a second language, every learner is more visual than oral, because it's much easier to, sorry, I'm bumping my desk a lot, aren't I? I'll move away. It's much easier to read than listen to a language that you're not familiar with. I think there's a lot of myths around learning style. Now, in terms of levels of language proficiency, this is a whole different topic that we could spend another hour on, differentiated learning. I think there are lots of strategies you can find out online about differentiated learning with learners with diverse proficiencies. It's about, I guess the first point I would make is that task-based language teaching is more flexible and more collaborative, and therefore allows greater scope for differentiated learning than tightly controlled teacher-fronted exercises. In other words, you give learners a well-designed, well-structured task, and they work together on the task in pairs or groups. You can mix up the groups so that the weak learners are with stronger learners. And then each group with a task has a lot of flexibility as to how they want to do the task. And so they can actually work within their limitations. They can help each other. And they've got flexibility as to how they might solve the task problem. So I think there's a lot of flexibility in task-based language teaching, which people don't appreciate. And they just think, oh, it's going to be too hard because my learners are diverse. but that's not the case at all. How can teachers balance fluency and accuracy? Two answers to that. One is that tasks should not be seen as fluency activities, because when learners are doing tasks, they are learning new vocabulary and new structures as they do the task. They're getting feedback, they're negotiating for meaning, and also at the end of the task, they should be then doing some kind of accuracy work. So the post-task phase can involve reflecting on the errors that you made, doing a grammar check activity, doing a vocabulary activity, whatever. So you've got plenty of scope for accuracy work within a task-based framework. The main difference is that a task-based approach does not treat the task as a place to practice language that you have been drilled. Sorry, I said that rather clumsily. A task-based approach does not treat the task as a place to practice drilled language. It treats the task as a place to discover the language, to learn what your gaps are, to try out the language, to struggle, to make mistakes, but in the process, to develop your grasp and your confidence and your competence in using the language, combined with feedback, opportunities after the task for a clear focus on accuracy and on complexity and on studying grammar, pronunciation, vocabulary, spelling, whatever. It's 4:30. Good questions. I could go much deeper into the questions, but I've taken your time for 2 hours, so I think we should probably all go and have a cup of tea. In my case, something perhaps a little bit stronger than a cup of tea, because it's 4:30.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor Dr. Jonathan Newton, for your very insightful lecture on task-based learning. And I would like to invite our chairman, the Associate Professor Dr. Akhar Ponnermaiholm, to please give a thankful message to our lectures and also officially close the webinar, please. Please turn on your microphone, sir.
Thank you very much for reminding me. I'm getting old, so I forget things easily. Thank you, MC Rajabhat, for carrying out the session very effectively. I think all of you agree with me, with no doubt, that the webinar carried out by our invited speaker from New Zealand today is very useful and, of course, very insightful. And I'm very certain that all of you will be able to apply whatever suggested by our speaker today to your current study very effectively and successfully. I just talked to Professor Jonathan this morning really about the materials or PPTs of his lecture today. He said that not prior to the webinar, but later on after his lecture. So after our webinar, I will forward his PPT to you for further studies. And more than that, the task-based text or books, Professor Jonathan also recommend me to read now in my hand. I have about three books relevant to task-based. So if you're interested, please let me know. I can forward to you this electronic book. Very useful, very insightful indeed about task-based. Thank you very much, Professor Jonathan, for recommending me to read this book. I read it already. Very good indeed. So thank you, our academic partner from different universities, both Thailand and overseas, for your energetic participation in our Ph.D. ELT webinar. We highly hope to have you with us again next time. And of course, thank you so much, my PhD student, for being a very good host of this webinar. Last but not least, I would like to again invite all of you, please join me in giving a big round of applause to express our sincere thanks to invited speaker, Professor Jonathan from New Zealand. Thank you so much. And I highly hope to see you again in person at BU campus, Thailand next time, sir. Thank you so much. Once again, please take care and keep in touch. Thank you.
I'm going to sneeze, sorry. Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody, for your patience. Thank you for coming along today. And I hope that you've found something useful in the 3 case studies that I've shared. It's great to see you all again. And actually, I will be in Thailand in 3 weeks' time. I'll be in Bangkok for about 10 days. So I'm looking forward to...
When are you going to Thailand?
I arrive in Thailand on the 17th and I leave on the 30th of June. So 2 weeks. The last 2 weeks.
Keep in touch with you is available. We would like to invite you to Buriram again. Let's see.
Thank you.
Thank you. So please allow me to declare our webinar opportunity closed. See you again next time. Take care. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Goodbye, everybody.
For my PhD student, after 5 minutes, we will resume our session to have a small talk, so-called ad hoc meeting. See you after 5 minutes. ขอบคุณครับพี่สุริชัยอยู่ด้วยนะครับขอบคุณครับสวัสดีครับ See you. Bye bye.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Okay.